Melbourne in the 1880s and 1890s was known as Marvellous Melbourne for its wealth, sophistication and grandeur. Today it's a truly cosmopolitan city with a style and energy of its own, but it retains a great legacy from the days of Marvellous Melbourne. Much of this legacy is the work of a Cornish architect, Joseph Reed. When Reed arrived in Melbourne in July 1853, the whole colony was in the grip of gold fever. Just 2 years earlier, Victoria had been officially proclaimed as a colony independent of New South Wales, and within weeks of the jubilant independence celebrations, the once orderly town was thrown into chaos by the discovery of gold. Melbourne's dusty streets were abuzz with frenzied activity as diggers hurried to and from the goldfields. As the deluge of gold continued, wealth was flowing freely in Melbourne town. The population was exploding and commerce was booming. By then, Melbourne boasted a few substantial public buildings: the original town hall and police court, a treasury building, a stone custom building, a 2-storey Supreme Court building, and a scattering of churches. But as the capital of the wealthy new colony of Victoria, named in honour of the popular young monarch of the British Empire, Melbourne was in dire need of buildings more befitting. It was to this exciting, rowdy scene that the 30-year-old Joseph Reed arrived to start a new life. Reed had studied draftsmanship at school and architecture in London, likely working on the designs for Westminster Palace. He was a skilled draftsman and designer, familiar with the classical and Gothic revival architectural styles that were favoured in Britain at the time. Arriving in Melbourne, he found himself in the right place at the right time, with opportunities abounding for skilled architects. He immediately threw himself into design competitions for new public buildings. His first major success was his design for the Melbourne Public Library, submitted as the competition closed just a few months after his arrival. The library had been conceived by the influential Supreme Court judge Sir Edmund Barry. Barry saw it as the people's university, making knowledge and information freely available to everyone in the colony, regardless of their status or wealth. It was to be one of the very early free libraries anywhere in the world. To house this university for the people, Reed designed a building with a grand facade in the Italian Renaissance style, embellished with detail from a variety of other styles. The first stage of the Melbourne Public Library, the central portion of the current building, was opened in February 1856. The second stage, the southern wing and the upstairs reading room, was completed 3 years later and opened on Queen Victoria's 40th birthday, May the 24th, 1859. The reading room was named the Queen's Reading Room in her honour. The next stage was the addition of the northern wing, completed in 1864. The portico was added the following year, with changes from the Ionic order that Reed had originally envisaged to Corinthian, and 8 columns instead of 6. The completed building, now the State Library of Victoria, was part of a master plan that Reed developed over subsequent years for a library and museum complex. Had it ever been completed, his original design would have covered the whole site bounded by Swanston, Latrobe, Russell and Little Lonsdale streets, and would have been one of the greatest building complexes of the British Empire. Today, the State Library of Victoria is undoubtedly the university for the people that Barry had in mind, with its famous reading room dome designed by Reed's firm after his death and completed by 1913. While construction of the library was underway, Reed had been busy on other projects, winning the design competition for the Bank of New South Wales in Collins Street, whose facade now graces the Melbourne University School of Design. He also designed the Collins Street Baptist Church with its elegant Roman Revival portico and the Gothic Revival Wesleyan Church in Lonsdale Street. He was appointed architect for the University of Melbourne, and his firm designed a number of university buildings over the next 40 years. In partnership with Frederick Barnes, Reed designed the classical Royal Society building in Victoria Street. With his talent for working in a range of architectural styles already evident, Reed toured Europe to absorb more ideas. In particular, he was impressed by the brick architecture of northern Italy, which he later used in several Melbourne buildings. The independent church in Collins Street, built in 1867 on the site of Melbourne's first permanent church, is a marked contrast to the stern Gothic Scots church across the road, which Reed also designed. Its Lombardic Romanesque exterior was one of the earliest uses of polychrome brickwork in Melbourne. The church facade and campanile were built with dark-coloured bricks, while the ornamental brickwork used white and bright red bricks, all locally made. The Romanesque interior was designed to optimise the church's acoustic properties, a quality that Reed would have been sensitive to as he himself was an accomplished violinist. Reed was now entering the most productive years of his life, drawing upon his extensive toolkit of architectural styles to design buildings of remarkable diversity. Working with his partner Frederick Barnes, he designed the Menzies Hotel in Italianate style, but also drawing upon 16th century French chateaux. Sadly, this grand building was demolished in 1969. The new Melbourne Town Hall was a return to Second Empire classicism, using French Renaissance style with slate mansard roofs. The central portico in Swanston Street was added in 1887, 17 years after the building was opened. Reed and Barnes continued to win competitions for buildings including the Melbourne Trades Hall, the Bank of Australasia in Collins Street, and the expansive Eastern Market that became a Melbourne landmark until it was demolished in the 1960s. One of the most beautiful buildings that Reed and Barnes designed was Melbourne University's Wilson Hall. It was in Tudor perpendicular style reminiscent of various Oxford colleges and King's College Chapel, Cambridge, with buttresses and pointed arches. Inside, the roof was an elaborately carved hammer beam structure. Sadly, this magnificent hall was burnt beyond repair in 1952. Reed next embarked on the building that would be the pinnacle of his career, the Royal Exhibition Building. In the late 1870s, following 3 successful intercolonial exhibitions, Victoria was suffering an economic downturn caused by drought, and there was strong support for a proposed international exhibition similar to Sydney's 1879 exhibition to be held in Melbourne in 1880 to give the economy a boost. A competition was held for the design of a new exhibition building, and once again Reed and Barnes took out the honours with an entry called Advance. It would be the largest building so far constructed in Melbourne. Reed brought all of his diverse and innovative design skills to bear on the building. Drawing on the London Crystal Palace and the Sydney Exhibition Hall, the Great Hall was laid out in the cruciform shape of a huge cathedral with a long nave and narrow transepts. At each of the 4 extremities of the cross, triumphal entrance porticos emphasised the grandeur of the building, and a huge dome reminiscent of the Florence Cathedral was built above the centre of the cross. A staircase from the south portal led to an external promenade which gave an unprecedented view over the Carlton Gardens to the city. The architectural detail of the Great Hall was based on the German round arch style, combining elements from Byzantine, Romanesque, Lombardic, Tuscan, and Italian Renaissance architecture. While Italy was the source of much of Reed's inspiration, he felt no compunction about remaining faithful to the architecture of any one country or period. Construction began in February 1879, and Reed and Barnes closely oversaw the whole process, including construction and decoration of the permanent exhibition building and the acres of temporary annexes built behind, as well as the landscaping of the surrounding gardens. In the lead up to the opening of the exhibition, the pace became frantic. A massive organ built by local organ maker George Fincham was installed in the western nave to be played at the opening ceremony. The interior of the Great Hall was decorated with stencilled ornamentation in the style used for the 1862 London exhibition. Outside, a colossal ornamental fountain was installed on the south side of the Great Hall. The gush of water spouting from it was regarded as a fine demonstration of the success of Melbourne's Yan Yean reticulated water system. The frenzy of preparation intensified as exhibitors arrived in the months before the grand opening. Joseph Reed was at the centre of the action, responding to demands from all quarters over anything to do with the buildings and facilities, and fending off some biting criticisms of his design at the same time. Finally, all was in readiness for the opening day, October 1st, 1880, when local and visiting dignitaries assembled with around 7,000 paying visitors. A grand parade of military bands and mounted and marching uniforms made its way through the city streets, cheered on by the crowds. A choir and orchestra of over 1,000 people gave a rousing rendition of God Save the Queen. The Melbourne International Exhibition lasted for 7 months, and it was a huge success in that it attracted nearly 1.5 million visitors, although it made a substantial financial loss. The exhibition building was a proud expression of Melbourne's confidence as a city that would be known as Marvellous Melbourne for the next decade. It was used again for the 1888 Centennial Exhibition, and then in 1901 for the inauguration of Australia's first federal parliament. Today, the exhibition building is World Heritage listed as the only remaining intact Great Hall designed for the industrial exhibitions of the 19th century. Reed's contributions to Marvellous Melbourne were to continue for another decade, although he was dealt a great blow with the death in 1884 of his longtime partner Frederick Barnes, with whom he'd collaborated on so many public and residential buildings for over 20 years. Reed formed a new partnership to create Reed, Henderson and Smart, and so the business he formed back in 1853 has operated continuously to the present day to become Australia's second oldest architectural firm, currently known as Bates Smart. Throughout his career, Reed had remained single and dedicated to his two great loves of architecture and music. However, in March 1885, at the age of 63, he married Hannah Elliott Lane, 30 years his junior, and the day after their wedding they set off on another 18-month tour of Europe. Sadly, their marriage was not destined to last long, as in 1890 Reed's health deteriorated rapidly and he died that year at his home in Hawthorn. Joseph Reed has long been regarded as the architect who created Melbourne. He was, of course, not the only talented architect to contribute wonderful buildings to the city in the 19th century, but for 40 years he dominated the profession, setting the pace for architectural innovation as well as the classical forms which characterised the Victorian era. Today, Melbourne is a modern city with a unique heritage, blending old and new. The buildings designed by Joseph Reed that still remain are essential to the character of Melbourne, and they ensure that Melbourne will always be marvellous.